The glass didn't just break, it exploded. It was a million diamonds of security shattering across the polished linoleum of the Mall of America's West entrance. And behind it came a sound that didn't belong in a civilized world. It was a scream, but not human, a wet, guttural shriek that sounded like someone's throat was being shredded by their own vocal cords just to let the sound out. My name is Jax, and 20 minutes ago, I was worried about my overtime pay and whether I'd make it home for my daughter's 8th birthday. Now, I was staring down the throat of the end of the world. My boots crunched on the safety glass as I raised my MCX Virtus. The red dot of my Trigicon danced across the chest of something that used to be a mall security guard. His name tag said Gary. Gary's jaw was hanging by a single tendon, swinging like a pendulum as he lunged through the broken portal. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. 2 rounds to the high center mass. Gary didn't even flinch. He just kept coming, his sneakers squeaking on the blood-slicked floor. My partner, Miller, a 15-year veteran who'd seen everything from the 2020 riots to cartel busts, was shouting something into his radio. But the air was thick with the smell of ozone, burnt cinnamon from the empty ends nearby, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The American dream was literally being eaten alive in front of us. We were supposed to be the line. The SWAT team called in for a mass casualty event. They didn't tell us the casualties were getting back up. We retreated back toward the Nickelodeon universe, the massive indoor theme park that sits like a neon-lit heart in the center of the mall. The lights were flickering, casting long, jerky shadows of the roller coasters against the ceiling. The log chute ride was still running, the mechanical water splashing rhythmically, but instead of laughing kids, the boats were carrying piles of gray, twitching limbs. Every time a boat dropped, a spray of pinkish mist filled the air. My heart was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. We were trapped in the biggest consumer monument in the United States, 5 million square feet of glass, steel, and death. Miller grabbed my shoulder, his glove slick with someone else's life. Jax? The armory room in the basement. If we don't get more mags, we're just meat with badges. He was right. We were burning through ammo like water. I looked up at the balconies. People were jumping. Not from fire, but to escape the things closing in on the railings. I saw a woman in a Nordstrom suit go over the edge, her scream cut short by the wet thud on the floor 3 levels down. Before her body even stopped twitching, they were on her. They moved with a jerky, frantic energy, like insects. The mall's PA system started playing Walking on Sunshine. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. We pushed past the Lego store, where a giant yellow dragon made of plastic bricks looked down at a pile of corpses. I felt a sob catch in my throat. My daughter wanted that dragon for her birthday. I didn't have time to mourn. 3 of them burst out from the Disney store. They were small. Kids. Or they had been. Their faces were masks of raw muscle and black veins. I squeezed the trigger until my bolt locked back. Smoke curled from the barrel, stinging my eyes. We hit the service stairs, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind us. For a second, it was quiet. Just the sound of our heavy breathing and the distant, muffled roar of the mall dying. The air in the stairwell smelled of dust and old grease. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 Alpha," Miller gasped into his shoulder mic. "We are black on ammo, trapped in Sector 4. Where is the extraction?" Silence. Then, a voice crackled through, barely audible over the sound of screaming in the background of the precinct. "God help you, 7 Alpha. There is no extraction. The city is gone. The Twin Cities are dark. Hold your position." Miller looked at me, and I saw the light go out in his eyes. He thought about his suburban house in Egan, his golden retriever, the life he built. It was all gone. The security of the badge, the authority of the uniform. It meant nothing in a world where the dead didn't respect the law. We started down the stairs, our tactical lights cutting through the darkness like twin swords. Every shadow was a threat, Every creak of the building's massive frame felt like a footstep. We reached the basement level, the industrial heart of the MOA. Huge pipes hissed steam, and the smell of sewage was overpowering. We found the tactical lockers, but the door was hanging off its hinges. Someone had already been here, and they hadn't left. A massive figure emerged from the gloom of the locker room. It was a fellow officer, a guy I'd played poker with on Friday nights. He was wearing his full riot gear, making him look like a tank of rotting flesh. He'd been bitten through the neck, the jagged wound pulsing with black ichor. He charged, the weight of his gear making him slow but unstoppable. I swung my empty rifle like a club, the stock connecting with his helmet with a sickening crack. He didn't feel it. He pinned me against a concrete pillar, his teeth snapping inches from my throat. I could smell him, the smell of a butcher shop left out in the July sun. Miller jammed his combat knife into the base of the officer's skull, twisting until the struggling stopped. We slumped to the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of our brothers. We were in the basement of the world's most famous mall, and we were completely alone. But we weren't going out like that. I grabbed a fresh vest, stuffed it with magazines I found on the floor, and looked at Miller. "We aren't dying in a basement," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "We're going to the roof. We're getting out of this tomb." But as I spoke, the sound started. A rhythmic pounding on the steel door above us. Thump. 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 It wasn't one person. It was hundreds. They knew we were here. They could smell the sweat, the fear, the life. The mall was no longer a place of shopping, it was a giant feeder. And we were the last course. The steel door didn't just rattle, it groaned. The heavy industrial bolts straining against the sheer kinetic force of 1,000 rotting bodies pressing from the other side. Miller and I didn't speak. We didn't have to. We were two men who had spent a decade training for the unthinkable, but there was no manual for a world that had decided to stop staying dead. I could see the sweat carving clean lines through the tactical grease paint on Miller's face. He looked older, tired, like he'd aged 20 years in the last 6 hours. I gripped my rifle, the cold polymer of the grip a strange comfort against my shaking palms. I checked my round count, 14 in the mag, 1 in the chamber. 3 spare mags on the vest I'd scavenged. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The pounding grew more frantic, a wet, heavy sound that resonated in my teeth. The door began to buckle in the center, a hairline fracture appearing in the weld. "The freight lift," Miller hissed, pointing toward a dark alcove at the back of the maintenance bay. It wasn't an elevator for people, it was a heavy-duty platform for hauling pallets of merchandise. We didn't know if the power was still holding, or if the grid had finally succumbed to the chaos outside, but it was our only play. We sprinted, our boots slapping against the damp concrete, the sound echoing like gunshots in the confined space. Just as we reached the lift, the steel door at the top of the stairs gave way. It didn't just open, it exploded inward under the pressure. A tide of gray, tattered shapes poured into the basement. A literal waterfall of the damned tumbling over one another in their desperation to reach the warmth of our living blood. Miller slammed his palm against the lift's control panel. A mechanical hum vibrated through the floor, a miracle of modern engineering or perhaps just cruel irony. The gate began to slide shut with agonizing slowness. I turned, dropping to one knee, the world narrowing down to the front sight post of my rifle. Asterisk squeeze. Reset. Squeeze. Reset. Asterisk. The first 3 things through the door weren't even standing, they were crawling, their limbs broken from the fall. Their jaws snapping at empty air. I put a round through each of their skulls, the muffled thwip of the suppressor the only sound over the rising cacophony of moans. Behind them, the rotunda of the basement filled with the smell, that cloying, sweet stench of decomposition mixed with the metallic tang of blood. They were pouring in like water through a broken dam. "Close, you son of a bitch, close!" Miller roared, his hand reaching for his sidearm. The gate was halfway shut when the first one reached us, a man in a torn security uniform, his chest a hollowed-out cavern of ribs and black sludge. I kicked him squarely in the chest, the impact feeling like hitting a bag of wet sand. He tumbled back into the mass, and the gate finally clicked into place. The lift shuddered and began its slow, grinding ascent. Through the diamond-shaped mesh of the gate, I watched the basement floor disappear, replaced by a sea of reaching, pale hands and the horrifying, rhythmic sound of fingernails scratching against the rising platform. The lift took us through the guts of the Mall of America. This wasn't the sparkling retail paradise the tourists saw. This was a labyrinth of gray drywall, exposed pipes, and buzzing transformers. We rose past the first floor, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of the central atrium. It was a vision from a fever dream. The Lego store was a wreckage of primary colors, the giant plastic models smashed and covered in dark, viscous smears. Below, in the Nickelodeon universe, the roller coasters sat like skeletal remains of extinct monsters. The silence of the park was the worst part. No music, no screaming kids, just the distant, omnipresent drone of the dead. We reached the third level, and the lift lurched to a halt. The power flickered, the emergency red lights casting long, jagged shadows across the corridor. "We need the service stairs to the roof," Miller said, his voice a rasping whisper. "If we can get to the top of the Nordstrom wing, there's a helipad for the high-end shoppers and VIPs. If the National Guard is still flying, that's where they'll look." I didn't have the heart to tell him the National Guard was likely gone, or worse, part of the crowd downstairs. I just nodded. We stepped off the lift, and into the dark. The third floor was the food court level, a massive open expanse that felt like a kill zone. To reach the stairs, we had to cross the bridge overlooking the amusement park. Every step felt like a gamble. My tactical training screamed at me, "Check your corners, watch your six, don't linger in the open star." But here, the rules were different. There were too many corners, and the six was everywhere. We moved in a staggered column, Miller covering the front, me checking our rear. The silence was heavy, thick with the ghosts of the thousands of people who had been here when the panic started. We passed a luxury watch boutique, the glass shattered, the gold and silver lying ignored on the floor. Wealth meant nothing now. A bottle of clean water was worth more than a Rolex. Suddenly Miller froze. He raised a hand, the universal signal for halt. I pulled my rifle into my shoulder, scanning the darkness. From the shadows of a nearby Auntie Anne's, a sound emerged. It wasn't a moan. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking. A lurker. That's what we called the ones who didn't wander, the ones who just sat and waited for the vibration of a footstep. Before I could react, it launched itself from behind a counter. It was fast, not the shambling gait of the others, but a frantic, spasmodic burst of energy. Miller fired, but his rifle jammed, a double feed, the nightmare of every operator. The creature was on him before he could transition to his knife. I didn't have a clear shot, Miller's body was in the way. I dropped my rifle and lunged, slamming my shoulder into the creature's flank. We hit the floor hard, sliding across the polished marble. It was a woman once, wearing a "World's Best Mom" shirt that was now stained a deep, crusty brown. Her fingers, stripped of skin, clawed at my face, her teeth clicking inches from my eyes. I could feel the coldness of her skin, the unnatural strength in her dead muscles. I managed to get a hand under her chin, pushing her head back while my other hand searched for the combat knife at my hip. The blade came free with a hiss of steel. I drove it upward, through the soft tissue under the jaw and into the brain. She went limp instantly, the weight of her body pinning me to the floor. I pushed her off, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Miller was on his knees, frantically clearing his jam. He looked at me, his eyes wide, a trickle of blood running down his forehead from the fall. "You okay?" he breathed. I nodded, wiping the black ichor from my knife onto my pant leg. "Keep moving," I said, the adrenaline beginning to crash, leaving a hollow, shaking cold in its wake. We skirted the edge of the balcony, looking down into the Nickelodeon universe. The moonlight filtered through the massive glass skylights, illuminating the floor below. It was moving. A carpet of gray and black, thousands of them, shuffling aimlessly between the tilt-a-whirl and the log chute. If we made a sound, if we dropped a magazine or tripped, they would look up. And if they looked up, it was over. We found the service door tucked behind a vending machine. It was locked from the inside. Miller didn't hesitate. He used a crowbar he'd snagged from the basement, prying the frame until the bolt snapped with a metallic crack that sounded like a grenade in the stillness. We waited, frozen, listening. Below us, the sea of dead stopped moving. Heads tilted. A collective moan, low and mournful, rose from the floor of the mall, a sound of hunger and recognition. "Go! Up! Now!" Miller hissed. The stairwell was a vertical tomb. It was narrow, the concrete walls closing in on us. We climbed, our lungs burning, the weight of our gear feeling like lead. My knees were screaming, and every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. We were on the 4th floor, then the 5th, heading for the maintenance levels above the public areas. As we climbed, the psychological weight began to settle. I thought about my wife, about the last text I'd sent her, *stay inside. I'm coming home. That felt like it happened in another lifetime, in a world that had sunlight and laughter. Now, there was only the mall. This monument to consumption had become a digestive tract, and we were the last bits of nutrition being squeezed through it. We reached a landing and Miller stopped, leaning his head against the cold concrete. He was shaking. I can't feel my legs, Jax," he whispered. I grabbed his shoulder, squeezing hard. "The roof, Miller. We get to the roof, we get the air, we get out. Don't you dare stop." I was lying. I didn't know if there was an out anymore. For all I knew, the whole world was a Mall of America now, a giant cage of glass and steel filled with things that used to be people. We pushed through the final door, and the change was instantaneous. The air hit us first, cold, crisp Minnesota air, smelling of pine and impending snow. After the recycled, death-tainted air of the mall, it felt like oxygen from a god. The roof was a vast, sprawling landscape of HVAC units, gravel, and satellite dishes. It was quiet. The wind whistled through the steel vents, a lonely, haunting sound. We stumbled toward the ledge, looking out over the parking lots. It was a graveyard. Thousands of cars, their headlights still on in some cases, forming a frozen river of metal. And between them, the shapes. They were everywhere, a slow-moving tide of shadows drifting through the suburban wasteland. The city of Bloomington was on fire in the distance, orange glows licking at the horizon, the smoke rising to meet the clouds. There were no sirens. No helicopters. Just the wind. "Where are they?" Miller asked, his voice small. "Where's the extraction?" I looked at the helipad. It was empty, save for a discarded flight helmet and a pile of spent brass. No one was coming. The realization hit me harder than the cold. We weren't rescued. We were just relocated to a higher vantage point to watch the world end. But then a sound. Not the moan of the dead, but something mechanical. Rhythmic. A heavy, thumping beat that wasn't coming from a door, but from the sky. We both turned, our eyes squinting against the darkness. To the east, over the darkened husk of the airport, a searchlight flickered. Then another. The low, guttural roar of a Chinook transport helicopter began to throb in the air, vibrating the gravel beneath our feet. "There!" Miller screamed, waving his arms like a madman. "They're here!" The helicopter was low, its black silhouette cutting across the moon. It was heading toward us, its spotlight sweeping the roof of the mall, illuminating the vents and the gravel in blinding white light. For a second, I felt a surge of hope so intense it made my head spin. We were going to make it. We were going to get off this tomb. But as the spotlight swept closer, it illuminated the base of the roof access door we had just come through. The door was heavy steel, but it was vibrating. Something was on the other side. Something that had followed our scent up 5 flights of stairs. The door didn't just open, it was torn off its hinges. The first wave didn't even look like people. They were a mass of gray limbs and gnashing teeth. A pressurized burst of hunger that had finally found its target. They flooded onto the roof, dozens of them, their eyes reflecting the helicopter's searchlight like predatory cats. "Defensive positions!" I yelled, though there was no position to take. We were backed against the ledge, 5 stories of drop behind us and a horde of the undead in front. The Chinook was hovering now, maybe 50 feet out, the downwash from its rotors kicking up a storm of gravel and dust that blinded us. A rope dropped from the side of the bird, a thick, braided lifeline swinging in the wind. "Go, Miller! Get to the rope!" I roared over the engine noise, raising my rifle and opening fire. This time, I didn't worry about conservation. I let the rifle sing, the muzzle flash lighting up the night in staccato bursts. The first line of zombies crumpled, but the ones behind them didn't care. They stepped over the fallen, their movements jerky and relentless. Miller scrambled toward the rope, his hands fumbling for the grip. He grabbed it, his feet swinging out over the abyss as the crew on the helicopter began to winch him up. "Jax! Grab on!" he screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar. I fired my last magazine, the bolt locking back on an empty chamber. I dropped the rifle, reached for my sidearm, and emptied that too. They were 10 feet away. 5 feet. I could see the individual hairs on the head of a teenage girl in a prom dress, her throat torn open, her hands reaching for my vest. I turned and leapt, my fingers clawing at the air. The rope was there, cold and rough. I gripped it with everything I had, the friction burning the skin off my palms as I slid down a few inches before catching myself. I felt a weight on my boot. I looked down. One of them, a man in a tattered business suit, had grabbed my ankle. His weight jerked my arm, nearly tearing it from its socket. He was hanging over the edge of the mall, his teeth snapping at my tactical boot, his eyes fixed on mine with a hollow, mindless intensity. I kicked, my other boot slamming into his face, but he wouldn't let go. He was a dead weight, literally, pulling me down, pulling me back toward the mall. The helicopter began to pull away, banking hard to the left. I was swinging in the air, suspended between the sky and the graveyard below. Miller was above me, reaching down, his hand outstretched. "Kick him off! Jax, kick him off!" I looked down at the mall roof one last time. It was covered in them now, a sea of white faces looking up, their arms reaching for the sky as if in prayer to a god of hunger. I took my combat knife, the one I'd used on the mom, in the food court, and I didn't stab the creature on my leg. I sliced through the leather of my own boot, the blade shearing through the laces and the tongue. With a sickening lurch, the boot slipped off. The zombie fell, a silent shadow plummeting 5 stories until he hit the pavement of the parking lot with a wet, distant thud. I was hauled upward, the wind whipping at my face, the mall shrinking beneath me. From this height, the Mall of America didn't look like a tomb anymore. It looked like a hive, a glowing, neon-rimmed monument to everything we had lost. I reached the cabin of the Chinook, Miller's hands grabbing my vest and dragging me onto the metal floor. I lay there, gasping, my chest heaving, my one bare foot cold against the diamond plate. I looked at the door gunner, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, his face pale behind his visor. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the horizon. I crawled to the edge and looked out. The fires in Bloomington weren't just fires. The whole horizon was a line of orange and black. St. Paul was burning. Minneapolis was a column of smoke. The world wasn't being saved. We were just moving to a different part of the slaughterhouse. I looked at Miller. He was staring at his hands, his knuckles white. We had survived them all. We had survived the feeder. But as the helicopter turned toward the dark, cold expanse of the Minnesota wilderness, I realized the truth. The mall wasn't the tomb. The world was. And we were just the last few ghosts wandering its halls. The roar of the Chinook's twin rotors was a physical weight. A rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the marrow of my bones and threatened to shake my teeth loose from their sockets. It was a sound that should have meant salvation. The mechanical heartbeat of a rescue that we had spent the last 48 hours praying for amidst the neon-lit nightmares of the Mall of America. But as I sat there on the cold diamond plate floor, watching the orange glow of a dying Twin Cities recede into the distance, the sound felt less like a heartbeat and more like a funeral dirge. Miller was a ghost of a man sitting across from me. His tactical vest was shredded, his face a mask of dried blood and soot, and his eyes, usually sharp, calculated, and professional, were staring at a point 3 inches behind the opposite bulkhead. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had left his soul back in the food court, somewhere between the Auntie-Anne's and the piles of the twitching dead. The door gunner, that kid with the visor, finally turned his head. His gloved hand gripped the handle of the M240H machine gun so tightly that the fabric was straining. He didn't offer us water. He didn't offer us a thermal blanket. He just watched us with a terrifying, clinical detachment. I tried to speak, my throat feeling like it had been scraped with a rusted rasp. I wanted to ask where we were going. I wanted to ask about the rest of the unit. I wanted to ask if there was anyone left at the precinct. But the words died in my mouth because, through the open bay door, I saw the sky over the northern suburbs flicker with the strobe light intensity of distant artillery. They weren't just fighting the outbreak, they were glassing the map. The altitude climbed, and the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. My bare foot was turning a waxy, translucent blue, the skin numb and dead against the metal. I reached down and rubbed it, trying to force some life back into the limb, but my hands were shaking too hard to be of much use. The vibrations of the helicopter changed, a subtle shift in the pitch of the engines, as we banked hard toward the northwest. Away from the populated corridors and into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the Iron Range. That was when the radio chatter started bleeding through the cabin's intercom system. Loud enough for me to catch fragments over the scream of the wind. Words like Protocol 9, biological sieve, and sanitization drifted through the air like toxic ash. I looked at Miller. He had heard it too. His head tilted up, his eyes finally focusing, locking onto mine. There was a silent communication between us, a shared understanding forged in the blood-slicked corridors of the mall. We weren't being rescued. We were being quarantined. And in a world where the dead walked, quarantine didn't mean a hospital bed and a warm meal. It meant a shallow trench and a gallon of lime. The betrayal didn't happen with a shout or a dramatic reveal. It happened with the click of a safety being disengaged. The door gunner, the kid who looked like he belonged in a high school locker room, slowly began to rotate his weapon inward. The heavy barrel of the M240 didn't point toward the darkness outside anymore. It tracked across the floor toward my chest. "Sir?" The kid's voice came over the internal comms, tinny and distorted by the flight helmet. "I need you both to remain seated. Do not move your hands toward your belts. We have orders to process all Level 4 survivors before landing." Miller's hand moved an inch toward the holstered Glock on his thigh, a movement so subtle I almost missed it. "Easy, son," Miller said, his voice a low growl that carried over the engine noise. "We're SWAT. We're on your side. We've been holding the line in that mall for 2 days. We have intel. We have data on the vectors." The kid didn't flinch. "Orders are orders, Sergeant. You were in the red zone. You've been exposed to aerosolized fluids for over 48 hours. You're a liability." The tension in the cabin became a living thing, sharper than the cold biting at my skin. I looked past the gunner, out into the night. We were flying over a dense carpet of pine trees now, the white snow beneath reflecting the dim moonlight. There were no lights from houses, no glowing windows of farmsteads. Just a void. I realized then that they weren't taking us to a base. They were taking us to a hole in the woods. Miller! I whispered, the name a warning. But Miller was already moving. He didn't go for his gun. He went for the gunner. In one fluid, desperate motion, Miller launched himself across the vibrating floor. It was a suicidal move, a leap of faith across a 4-foot gap while the world screamed around us. The gunner panicked, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Miller was faster, slamming his weight into the barrel of the machine gun, forcing it downward. A burst of 7.62 rounds ripped into the floor of the Chinook, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cabin in jagged, strobe-light bursts of white and yellow. The sound was deafening, a jackhammer rhythm that shattered my eardrums. I didn't think. My training took over, the muscle memory of a decade of tactical entries and high-stakes takedowns. I lunged forward, grabbing a discarded riot shield that had been tossed into a corner of the bay. I used it as a battering ram, slamming into the gunner from his blind side just as he tried to pull a sidearm. We became a thrashing knot of limbs and nylon webbing on the edge of the open door. The wind howled through the bay, pulling at us, the vacuum of the flight trying to suck us out into the frozen abyss. I saw the gunner's visor shatter against the edge of the shield, his young face suddenly exposed, terrified, bleeding. And utterly convinced he was doing the right thing. He wasn't the monster. The people who gave the order were. Miller had his arm wrapped around the kid's throat, trying to pull him back, but the gunner was fighting with the strength of a cornered animal. In the chaos, the Chinook suddenly bucked. An alarm started screaming in the cockpit, a high-pitched, warbling wail that signaled a critical failure. The gunner's accidental burst had done more than just scuff the floor, it had severed something vital in the belly of the bird. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cabin, a hot, acrid mist that smelled of chemicals and burnt sugar. The floor tilted violently to the left. I lost my footing, sliding toward the open door. My fingers clawed at the diamond plate, my nails snapping as I tried to find purchase. I saw the dark expanse of the Minnesota wilderness rushing up to meet us. Miller reached out, his hand grabbing the collar of my vest, his boots braced against the base of the machine gun mount. "I got you!" he roared, his face turning purple with the effort. But the helicopter was dying. The rotors were losing their rhythm, the steady thrum replaced by a grinding, metallic shriek as the transmission began to disintegrate. The pilot's voice was a frantic scream over the speakers, but I couldn't make out the words. Then came the impact. We didn't hit the ground, we hit the trees. It was a sound like 1,000 dry bones snapping at once. The Chinook tore through the canopy of the old-growth forest, the branches stripping the skin off the fuselage like a predator flaying its prey. The world became a kaleidoscope of green, brown, and white, followed by a bone-jarring slam that threw me forward. My head hit something hard, the edge of a crate, the bulkhead, I didn't know, and the world went black. I woke up to a silence that was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, mournful howl of the wind through the pines. I was lying in a snowdrift, the cold finally reaching deep into my chest. I couldn't feel my legs. For a long, panicked moment, I thought I was paralyzed, but then the pain arrived, a searing, white-hot agony in my ribs and shoulder that told me I was very much alive. I rolled onto my stomach, coughing up a mouthful of copper-tasting blood. The Chinook was a broken carcass 20 yards away, its tail boom snapped like a twig and draped over a fallen cedar. Fire was licking at the ruptured fuel lines, casting long, dancing shadows against the snow. I looked for Miller. I found him slumped against a tree, his chest heaving, his hands pressed against a jagged piece of aluminum that was protruding from his thigh. He looked at me, his eyes glazed with shock. "The kid?" he rasped. I looked back at the wreck. The door gunner was still in there, or what was left of him. The cockpit was crushed, a mangled mess of glass and steel. There would be no more orders. No more Protocol 9. Just us. I crawled toward Miller, each movement a masterpiece of suffering. I reached into my med pouch, pulling out a tourniquet. My hands were shaking, my fingers clumsy and frozen, but I managed to loop it around his leg. Don't bother, Miller whispered, his voice fading. Look! He pointed a trembling finger toward the treeling. At first, I didn't see anything but the shadows. But then, the shadows moved. They were emerging from the darkness, drawn by the light of the fire and the sound of the crash. They weren't the fast, frenzied runners we had fought in the mall. These were different. They were slow, their movements stiff and jerky, their skin blue with frostbite and covered in a layer of rime ice. They looked like statues come to life, ancient and relentless. They were the survivors of the small towns, the hunters, the hikers, the people who had thought the woods would be safe. They had died in the cold, but the cold hadn't stopped the hunger. There were dozens of them, a silent circle closing in on the wreck. I reached for my holster. Empty. I looked around desperately, my eyes landing on a discarded survival axe near the debris. I hauled myself to my feet, my breath coming in ragged, frozen plumes. My bare foot hit the snow, and the cold was so sharp it felt like stepping on a bed of needles. I gripped the axe, the handle slick with hydraulic fluid. Miller looked up at me, a grim smile touching his lips. He pulled a single fragmentation grenade from his vest, the last one he had. Go, he said. I'll give you a head start. I'm not leaving you, Miller, I said, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. That's an order, officer, he replied, his voice regaining a ghost of its command authority. I'm a dead man with a piece of a helicopter in my leg. You're the one who makes it out. You're the one who tells them what happened in that mall. You tell them we didn't just hide. We fought. The first of the frozen dead stepped into the firelight. Its jaw was missing, its tongue a black, shriveled ribbon hanging over a throat filled with ice. I looked at Miller one last time. He gave me a sharp, professional nod, the kind we used to give each other before breaching a door. I turned and ran. I didn't look back when the first snarls broke the silence. I didn't look back when the sound of the grenade detonated, a dull thump that echoed through the valley, followed by the secondary explosion of the Chinook's fuel tanks. The sky behind me turned a brilliant, searing orange, casting my long shadow across the pristine white snow ahead. I ran until my lungs burned like they were filled with acid. I ran until I couldn't feel the pain in my shoulder or the frostbite in my foot. I ran until the fire behind me was just a dim glow, and the only sound was the crunch of my own footsteps in the crusty snow. Hours passed. Or maybe days. Time had lost its meaning in the white void. I found myself on an old logging road, the ruts filled with ice. I followed it, driven by a primal instinct to keep moving, to find a horizon that wasn't on fire. That was when I saw it. A light. Not the flickering, chaotic light of a fire, but the steady, artificial glow of a perimeter lamp. I crested a small rise and looked down into a valley. There was a facility there, a low-slung, concrete bunker surrounded by double-layered chain-link fences and rolls of concertina wire. There were towers with searchlights sweeping the perimeter, and I could see the silhouettes of armed men walking the catwalks. This wasn't a civilian camp. It was a fortress. And as I watched, a convoy of heavy trucks rolled through the gates, their tarpaulin covers marked with the same symbol I had seen on the Chinook. I crouched in the shadows of the pines, my heart hammering against my cracked ribs. I wanted to run toward them. I wanted to scream for help. But then I saw what they were unloading from the back of the trucks. They weren't crates of food or medical supplies. They were bodies. Hundreds of them. They were dumping them into a massive, steam-shrouded pit in the center of the compound. And then I saw the movement. Some of the bodies were twitching. Some were trying to crawl out of the pile. A soldier on the rim of the pit calmly lowered a flamethrower and squeezed the trigger. A gout of liquid fire cascaded into the hole, and the valley was filled with a sound that I will hear until the day I die, the collective, high-pitched shriek of hundreds of voices being silenced at once. I realized then that the Mall of America hadn't been an anomaly. It wasn't just a failure of containment. It was the blueprint. The world wasn't being saved, it was being pruned. They were burning the infected, the exposed, and the inconvenient, regardless of whether they were dead or alive. I looked at my hands, blackened with soot and stained with the blood of my friends. I was a ghost. I was a level 4 survivor. I was a liability. I turned away from the light of the fortress and looked back into the dark, frozen heart of the woods. The wilderness wasn't a tomb. It was a sanctuary. Out there, the dead were the only thing I had to fear. In here, it was the living. I gripped the survival axe tighter, the cold metal biting into my palm, and I began to walk. I wasn't going to a camp. I wasn't going to a base. I was going into the dark. Because in a world of monsters and the men who burned them, the only way to survive was to become something else entirely. I wasn't a SWAT officer anymore. I was a scavenger. I was a hunter. I was the last thing the end of the world would see coming. The snow began to fall again, soft and white, covering my tracks, erasing the last evidence that I had ever existed. I disappeared into the trees, a shadow moving among shadows, while behind me, the world continued to burn. The silence of the Minnesota wilderness was not the silence of peace, it was a heavy, suffocating weight. A vacuum that sucked the air out of my lungs and replaced it with the scent of pine needles and rotting frost. I moved through the undergrowth with a grace I had never possessed back when I wore the heavy tactical plates and the blue uniform of the Bloomington Police Department. Back then, I was a tank, a battering ram designed to shatter doors and dominate rooms with noise and light. Now, I was a ghost. My gear was a patchwork of scavenged utility, strips of thermal insulation taped over my joints to silence the rustle of fabric. My old SWAT harness stripped of its weight but retaining its purpose. I had painted my axe handle a matte, dirty white to blend with the birch trees. Every breath was a calculated risk, timed to the wind so the white puff of vapor wouldn't betray my position to anything lurking in the brush. I had been out here for 3 months, or maybe 3 years. Time didn't move the same way it did inside the Mall of America. Inside those glass and steel walls, time was measured in the batteries of a flashlight or the diminishing rows of canned peaches in a food court pantry. Out here, time was the tilt of the sun and the depth of the snow. The dead in the woods were different from the ones in the mall. In the mall, they were frantic, trapped in a loop of consumerist echoes, stumbling over escalators and getting tangled in decorative holiday lights. In the woods, they were statues. The cold preserved them, turning their flesh into something resembling gray, unyielding stone. Sometimes I would find them standing perfectly still in a clearing, frozen solid mid-stride, eyes clouded with ice crystals. They were part of the landscape, and I learned to navigate them like one would navigate a minefield. You didn't kill them unless you had to. You didn't waste the energy or the noise. You just slid past them, a predator among the petrified. My mind often drifted back to the rotunda, to the screams that had echoed off the skylights when the perimeter first breached. I remembered the smell of the Cinnabon stand mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Those memories were the only things that kept me warm. They were a fire I stoked every night in the hollows of fallen oaks, a reminder of why I had walked away from the fortress of the living. The men in that base, the ones who called themselves the New Guard, they weren't building a future. They were building a cage. They were hungry for the same power that had failed the world in the first place. And I had seen enough of that power to know it always ended in a pile of bodies. I found the tracks on a Tuesday, or what I felt was a Tuesday. 3 sets of boots, heavy and deep, moving toward the ridge where I kept my secondary cache. They weren't moving with the aimless shuffle of the dead. These were rhythmic, purposeful, living men. And they were trailing a fourth set of prints, smaller, dragging a left foot. A child. Or a woman. Someone wounded. My pulse didn't quicken. That part of me was dead. Instead, my training took over, a cold, mechanical overlay that mapped the terrain into sectors and kill zones. I followed them for 2 miles, staying high on the ridgeline, my white camouflage making me invisible against the overcast sky. I saw them through the skeletal branches of the oaks, 3 men in mismatched military surplus, carrying rifles with the casual negligence of people who had never been shot at. They were Guard Scouts. I recognized the insignia on their parkas, a bastardized version of the state's seal. They had the girl cornered near a frozen creek bed. She was huddled against a rock, clutching a piece of rebar like it was a holy relic. She looked like I had looked in those final days in the mall, wide-eyed, hollowed out, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. One of the men laughed, a sound that jagged through the crisp air like a saw blade. He reached for her, and in that moment, the SWAT officer I used to be flickered to life, a dying ember suddenly fanned by a gale. I didn't think about my survival. I didn't think about my sanctuary. I thought about the oath I'd taken under the fluorescent lights of a precinct basement a decade ago. It was a stupid, beautiful lie, but it was the only thing I had left that wasn't covered in soot. I didn't use a gun. Noise was a death sentence in these woods, attracting every lurker for 5 miles. I dropped from the ridge, 180-pound weight of fury and precision. I landed on the first man before he could even turn, the head of my survival axe burying itself in the junction where his neck met his shoulder. The sound was a dull thud, followed by the hiss of hot blood hitting the snow. The second man scrambled for his slung carbine, but I was already moving, using the first man's falling body as a shield. I kicked his knee inward, felt the joint pop, and as he screamed, I drove the spiked pommel of the axe into his temple. The third man, the leader, managed to level his pistol. We stared at each other for a heartbeat. He saw a monster, a wild-eyed, frostbitten wraith with a blood-stained axe. I saw them all. I saw the supervisors who had locked the doors on the shoppers to save themselves. I saw the guards who had traded food for favors. "Wait," he stammered, his finger trembling on the trigger. "We're from the base. We're the good guys." I didn't give him a speech. I didn't tell him who I was. I just moved. The bullet whined past my ear, a hot streak of lead that vanished into the trees, and then I was on him. It wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. When it was over, the snow was no longer white. It was a vibrant, horrific crimson. I stood there, chest heaving, the steam rising from the bodies like they were vents in the earth. The girl was staring at me, her face a mask of pure terror. She wasn't looking at a savior. She was looking at the thing that had killed the wolves. "Go," I said. My voice was a rasp, a sound that hadn't been used in weeks. It felt like gravel in my throat. I pointed toward the south, away from the fortress, toward the old ranger station I knew was stocked with dry wood and a few remaining cans of soup. "Don't look back. Don't stop for the shadows. If it moves and it isn't the wind, you run." She didn't ask questions. She scrambled up, her small frame disappearing into the treeline like a startled deer. I watched her go, and for a second, I felt a pang of something, not regret, not joy, but a phantom limb of humanity. I could have gone with her. I could have tried to be a man again. But as I looked down at my hands stained with the fresh warmth of the living, I knew that door was closed. The Mall of America had been a temple of everything humanity wanted, and it had become a tomb for everything humanity was. I was the caretaker of that tomb. I stayed behind to strip the bodies of their gear. I took their ammunition, their lighters, their maps. I didn't feel like a thief. I felt like a scavenger collecting the discarded pieces of a broken machine. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and gold, I felt the first tremors of the night chill. The dead would be waking up now. The statues would begin to thaw just enough to move, their joints creaking like old floorboards as they resumed their eternal, hungry pilgrimage. I climbed back toward the ridgeline, my boots finding the familiar footholds in the rock. From the summit, I could see the distant, flickering lights of the fortress, the place I had fled. It looked so small from here. A tiny, fragile spark in a world of infinite darkness. They thought they were winning. They thought they could build walls high enough to keep the end of the world at bay. But I knew better. I had seen the walls of the greatest mall on earth crumble. I had seen the glass shatter. Walls are just a way of making sure you have nowhere to run when the fire starts. I reached my primary camp, a cave tucked behind a frozen waterfall, the ice hanging like a curtain of diamonds. I started a small, smokeless fire deep in the back. The flames reflecting in the eyes of the tactical helmet I still kept in the corner, the one with the cracked visor and the faded, SWAT lettering. I sat there for a long time, sharpening the blade of my axe with a whetstone, the rhythmic shik-shik-shik the only music in the world. I thought about my life before. I thought about the wife who had left me years before the world ended, about the father who had taught me how to hunt in these very woods, and about the rookie officer I had tried to save on the 3rd floor of the Nordstrom wing. They were all gone. They were ghosts, and I was their king. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for a rescue. I wasn't waiting for the government to return or for a cure to be found. Those were the dreams of the living, and I was something else. I was the balance. I was the thing that lived in the space between the monsters and the men. If the guard came looking for their scouts, they would find only the woods. If the dead came looking for warmth, they would find only my blade. I had become the mall itself, a vast, labyrinthine space filled with the remnants of a lost civilization. Dangerous to enter and impossible to truly leave. I leaned back against the cold stone wall and closed my eyes. For the first time since the first alarm went off in the Mall of America, the screaming in my head had stopped. The chaos of the food courts, the panic of the parking garages, the betrayal of the fortress, it all faded into the low hum of the wind outside the ice curtain. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a villain. I was a survivor. And in this new world, that was the only title that carried any weight. The snow continued to fall, a thick, white shroud that buried the bodies of the scouts, and the tracks of the girl and the memory of the man I used to be. I was a shadow moving among shadows. I was the last thing the end of the world would see coming. And as I drifted into a light, tactical sleep, my hand still resting on the handle of my axe, I knew one thing for certain: the mall was closed. The lights were out, and I was the only one left to patrol the aisles. I was home. The next morning, the world was a pristine, unbroken sheet of white. The silence was absolute. I stepped out from behind the waterfall, the cold air hitting my face like a physical blow, and I smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, it was a baring of teeth. I had a perimeter to check. I had snares to clear. I had a world to watch over. I adjusted the straps of my pack, felt the familiar weight of the axe at my hip, and began to walk. My tracks were the only blemish on the perfect snow, a single line of history being written across a blank page. I didn't look back at the fortress. I didn't look for the girl. I just looked forward, into the trees, into the white, into the beautiful, frozen end of everything. I was the hunter. I was the level 4 survivor. I was the SWAT officer who never left his post. And as long as I was breathing, the dark would have something to fear. The world had burned, but I was the ash that remained, and ash doesn't fear the fire. I disappeared into the timber, a ghost in a white world, the final guardian of a dead empire. Moving silently through the heart of the woods until I was nothing more than a memory carried on the winter wind.